Raz, dwa, trzy. Raz, dwa, trzy. Raz, dwa, trzy. 1, 2, 3, 4. Raz, dwa, trzy. Raz. 1, 2, 3, 4. Raz, dwa, trzy. Test. Test. 1. 1, 2, 3, 4. Raz, dwa, trzy. 1, 2, 3, 4. Raz, dwa, trzy. Test. Test. 1. 1, 2, 3. Raz, dwa, trzy. 1, 2.
Będzie dobrze.
To są do pytań?
To są do pytań.
Dobra, a oni będą na tamtych.
Raz, raz, raz.
Raz, dwa, trzy.
Raz, dwa, trzy.
Czekaj, będę czuwać. Dziękuję. Ja tu zostawię, dobrze? A Państwo są z telewizji? Tak. Z której?
Kto to tak położył? To nie jest twoja, Marta?
To jest kalendarz, to jest Asi.
Tak się nie kładzie.
Dzień dobry, Szanowni Państwo. Zapraszam do zabierania miejsc. Za chwilę będziemy zaczynać prezentację. Witam ponownie.
Welcome. I'd like to welcome you to the European Commission representation in Poland. We will start in a moment. Just a housekeeping remark. On first channel, we will provide simultaneous interpretation into Polish, second channel into English. I would like to give floor to Kinga Schlesinger, Deputy Head of the European Commission representation. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to welcome you to the House of Europe in the representation of the European Commission in Poland. I would like to thank you for coming. The topic of today's meeting is a report of the EU Agency for Fundamental Rights focused on the challenges which are faced by the civil society in the EU. This is a report on human rights and the agencies dealing with human rights. I would like to welcome the internet users who follow us on Facebook of the European Commission representation in Poland and those who follow us on Facebook of the FRA. I'm so glad to have Eva Sobotka with us today, who is the FRA Head of Sector Cooperation and Consultation. And we are very honored to have a special guest, Adam Bodnar, who is the Commissioner for Human Rights of the Republic of Poland, and he will make his comments to the report. Ladies and gentlemen, we can make a provocative statement saying that the European Union is not about ATM money and funds. It's about the freedoms, dignity, equality, respect for human rights. These are the values which are the foundation of the European Union, and they are actually provided in the treaties. The Charter of the European Union is actually the clear message on the values. Respect for these fundamental rights and values in the contemporary democracy is also represented by the European Union member states. Caring for human rights, providing support for freedoms, freedom activities of the representatives of the civil sector who care for the NGOs and who care for the human rights should be the task of the national authorities. We have to care for the high standards in the area of respect for human rights, respect for the administrative surrounding environment, providing support for the organization, supporting human rights. That's the basic things. The clear funding of civil society organizations, NGO organizations, is the basic thing to ensure respect for human rights. Very important elements here are the political climate, administrative climate, the active counteracting attacks against the activists for human rights, the right perception of their work. This is becoming of a great importance in the European Union of the 21st century. In our contacts with the external partners, the third parties, the European Union and EU member states stress often the importance of human rights, the development agreements or other type of agreements often provide for the closest on respect for human rights. And the European Union is also stressing the importance of support for the civil society organizations, providing fundings and providing non-material values and providing protection for the activists for human rights. But it's not the only dimension that is important, the external one. The internal space of this topic is also very important. Each and every member of the European Union should provide the optimum conditions for development of the civil society and for the protection of human rights. Isn't the case, really? That's what we are going to learn about in a moment. Without a further ado, I'd like to stress that the protection and support for the activists of the human rights is a very important thing for every EU member. There are, of course, many challenges. The challenges of various nature and character depending on the EU member states. The topic of today's meeting suffers from the limited number of the data and research, specifically comparative research data. That's why we are so glad to see the report of the FRA. Again, I would like to welcome you heartily. I would like to invite you for a discussion that will take place after the presentation of the report and the comments by Adam Bodnar.
Thank you very much for the warm welcome and for the opportunity to present here in Warsaw the recently published report on the challenges that civil society are facing in the EU when working on human rights issues. We have published the report in January, and we are now this year focusing very much on presenting it in different EU member states. Poland is the first member state where we actually try to, in dialogue with civil society, to present the findings of the report. And we also promote the findings of the report to a variety of international audiences, and that includes both institutions, EU institutions in Brussels, but also UN in Geneva, etc. Why are we bothering? Why are we doing that? We want to raise awareness of the challenges that civil society face, but also we want to draw attention to the essential value that civil society play when it comes to healthy functioning of democracies, functioning of the rule of law, and also in that regard point out to good practices that already exist. It's particularly important to the agency that we have the opportunity to actually engage in dialogue with civil society, follow up on the publication, but also to do that together with the Ombudsman and Bodnar. That's really good, because when we look at the civic space, it is a space that is shared by civil society, but it's also shared by national human rights institutions. Before I dive into the topic and present the details of the findings of the report, let me say a few words about how what the FRA is and how we cooperate with civil society. We are an independent EU body with the mandate to give advice to EU institutions and to EU member state governments on how to improve fundamental human rights in the area of EU competence. And we give this advice on a basis of concrete evidence. That means that we conduct studies, research, we really dialogue with a variety of stakeholders at different levels of governance. And I like to point out, and out literally, the fact that I'm not the only person who is linked to FRA here at this meeting today. I have maybe the pleasure to present and point out to Roman Wieruszewski, who is the member of the FRA Scientific Committee being a body that oversees the quality of the research findings that FRA is producing. In our mandate, we are also instructed to cooperate with civil society, and that cooperation goes across horizontal thematic areas. So the agency on the one hand has a focus on thematic areas. The cooperation with civil society goes slightly beyond that. And in order to be able to do it efficiently, we have a specific mechanism called the Fundamental Rights Platform, where civil society organizations can register and engage with us in cooperation. So As a human rights body, that the FRA is, we are quite concerned about the reports that we get from civil society organizations over the years through the platform, but also through other channels, about the situation in place. And this has been a recurring item, the so-called disappearing civic space or shrinking civic space, situation being increasingly difficult for a variety of reasons of civil society organizations to promote and advocate for human rights. So in order to be able to understand where the challenges are, we decided we're going to do collection of data, analysis, etc. We clustered our findings in 4 areas. These are regulatory environment, access to resources, participation, and safe environment. When it comes to the first area, so the enabling regulatory environment, that describes basically everything that it has to do with laws, in particular the freedom of assembly, freedom of association, and freedom of speech. And across the EU, we have seen a number of changes to laws and policies and practices that negatively affect civil society. Some of these effects are unintended and some are intended and result from either badly made laws or simply as a side effect of laws in different areas. Of course, the member states have legitimate interests in adopting legislation and administrative rules. However, it is important that these do adhere to international and EU standards, and they are not non-discriminatory, because in a combination of these 2 elements, what we find is that the impact of such laws can have a very chilling effect on civil society. Now, to give a few concrete examples. Often, with the argument of counterterrorism efforts, we have seen that freedom of assembly is partly restricted in a number of member states. And also on freedom of assembly, we see that in general, suddenly there was an increase on bans of assemblies at certain times and places. We also observe challenging regulations in the area of tax law. On the one hand, regarding organizations themselves, under charitable status, they would pay less taxes. On the other hand, for donors, so the question is it simply possible to deduct donation from tax? To name just one more, there is a particular challenge around transparency and lobby laws. It is crucial. At the same time, it is important that the work of civil society organizations is not unduly hindered. We do, in the report, make a number of opinions, and for the area of the regulatory environment, we have also a few ideas how to address the situation. So on the very basic level, we say the obvious, yet it shows, the practice shows that it needs a reminding that applicable EU and relevant international treaty law must be respected. And when it comes to drafting legislation in other areas, such as the examples that I have given, it pays off to do a check on the potential effect that these laws could have on civil society space. And last but not least, it should be also ensured that legislation does not have disproportionate requirements on civil society organizations in comparison to others. Now let me allow to move on the area on access to resources. Access to resources is an essential part of the freedom of associations. And the legal frameworks and policies that are in place and that have been adopted in recent years have significantly impacted on the ability of civil society organizations to find funding for their activities. There has been the issue of shrinking budgets, so the amount of fundings has become less available to lesser extent in some member states. In other member states, what we have observed is that the funding has shifted from or moved away from funding advocacy, litigation, and awareness-raising activities towards more provision of healthcare or social services. There is no argument that there should be a competition between these different areas of work or methods of work that a civil society engage in. However, if there is such a clear shift towards one type of activity that is being promoted, it impacts on the overall health of civil society. There have been reports that we have received concerning burdensome, complex, and not always transparent procedures when it comes to accessing and reporting on funding. That has, in particular, for smaller civil society organizations, not only in a matter of size, this has been an issue. The difficulties are also coming from the fact how the different funding mechanisms are structured, how they are conceptualized. So over time, the prevalence of short-term funding without availability of funding that would promote the infrastructure of the civil society is a problem. Therefore, the Endowment Fund for Human Rights and Democracy for civil society organizations, which actually does exist in EU external sphere of operation, does not exist internally in the EU. And the report does make recognition of the effort on a part of different EU institutions, the European Commission, but also the European Economic and Social Committee, to look into ways how such a fund could become available within the EU. There are good practices in funding as well, clearly. And what we find is that, for example, the efforts to dedicate certain percentage of lottery revenues to promote civil society work is worthwhile. It's a good practice. We find that in a number of member states. Additionally, when it comes to the typical requirement that in order to receive some funding, you need to have your own minimum funding to show, we actually find that volunteering as a contribution in the so-called co-financing purposes to be a good practice, and it seems that the European Commission will accept such a practice in the future. So when it comes to FRA opinions in the area of finance and access to resources, first of all, there has to be sufficient amount of funding, and secondly, there should be also, this funding should be available for a range of services and activities that the civil societies engage in. That includes litigation, service provision, human rights and civic education, but also awareness raising of rights as such. Equal access to funds is crucial, and it is important that funding is transparent, fair, non-discriminatory, and for the distribution of EU funds in particular, there are certain basic rules in place. In some member states, we found that there are some rules or considerations about restricting foreign funding, and it is important to note that as part of a free movement of capital within the European Union, civil society organizations should be free to solicit, receive, and utilize funding also from institutional and individual donors, that includes private donors, in other member states or from EU and international organizations, bodies, and agencies. That is an essential part of access to funding as foreseen under the freedom of association. Regarding a possible EU endowment fund for democracy that would operate internally, we consider it important that if such a fund will be created, the funds are available directly to civil society organizations. Now let me move to the third thematic area of the report, which is participation. And that, of course, includes concerns participation of civil society organizations in giving input on law and policy proposals. And that is, in a way, governments maintain in contact through civil society, through consultation, etc., or conduct such a reality check and include views of civil society organizations in the process of policymaking. That can only lead to an increase of ownership among constituencies. The right to participation in public affairs is also recognized in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 25, and it was also reaffirmed in the new Council of Europe Guidelines for Civil Participation and Political Decision-Making. What the challenges that we have found throughout our research ranges from limited access to information to lack of minimum standards. And in some member states, we also observed a lack of political will or understanding that consultation is not simply just a box-ticking exercise, but it does contribute to better policymaking. There has been, at occasion, lack of transparency regarding who is consulted, what is done with the input provided before decisions are made. And there is also some recognition that certain capacity building among public servants on how to conduct how to conduct consultation and involve the voice of civil society in the policymaking process is needed. So I'm speaking about a capacity of actually civil servants. I'm not speaking about the capacity of civil society. It is essentially a two-way street, but what we see through our research is that there is a lot of need of capacity building on public servants to simply know what the minimum standards are and adhere to some transparency rules. When it comes to our opinions, we do recommend that obviously that it would be worthwhile investing in available human resources to give sufficient time and also to look into ways how to optimize involvement of civil society organizations in providing input in the policymaking process. Participation processes should be transparent, and that's clear. And it is important that public services maintain dialogue with the broadest diversity of civil society organizations, not with just a select few, because that increasingly will not lead to an inclusive outcome. Finally, the fourth area of the report covers safe space. What do we mean by that? We have received a number of reports that civil society organizations or individuals associated with civil society organizations have faced physical and verbal attacks, have faced harassment, intimidation, both online and offline. And to give you just two examples of such attacks, the FRA got reports about a physical attack by two men on a member of the Human Rights Institute in Slovakia, and about an attack on the head of Bulgarian Helsinki Committee, who is also a member of the FRA, so our own management board. And this is of great concern for a number of reasons. One is that, first of all, data on such attacks is not being systematically collected. Therefore, if such a thing happens, it allows for certain dismissal of the act as isolated, and nothing is being done. And that is wrong, because that leads to a multiplying effect where such inaction can further fuel negative media and smear campaigns and lead to silence on the part of state officials where clearly such attacks should be condemned. There has been also a complacency when it comes to not respecting the importance of the safe space on the part of ministers from different countries who have critically assessed and accused civil society organization operating in a rescue at sea that they are conducting in smuggling business. That obviously does not help the effort to address the situation of migrants. And when such labeling comes from the top political level, it's very, very hard for civil society organization to counterbalance that argument. So what do we think? We think that there is a need to raise general awareness on the key role that civil society plays at large for democratic functioning, for fair and just society. And that concerns civil society that works on fundamental rights issues, but that also concerns institutions that share that civic space, and such as national human rights institutions, ombuds institutions, and equality bodies. And secondly, there is lack of data about these attacks, and it is really needed to simply keep a record of these attacks, because they are not isolated. Increasingly they are not, and if nothing is being done about addressing them, they will not disappear. The situation will get worse. So what will FRA do? We have published this initial report in an effort to understand better the challenges. It is the very first effort that the FRA is doing in this area. The time frame within which the data has been collected was 2009 until 2016. And we will continue with the data collection in place. Namely, later on this year, we will again conduct a consultation looking at challenges that civil society organizations working on human rights in the EU face. And we will also extend this consultation. So we will be asking the same questions to national human rights institutions, because as I said previously, this is a space that is shared by these entities as well. We will continue with presentation of the report results and dialogue with civil society at member states level. Before the report was published, we have formally published in January, we have already presented it to member states in council working party meetings, 2 council working party meetings in Brussels. And the dialogue and exchange with governments will further continue. We will also present the report findings at the Human Rights Council in Geneva in June in this year. Last but not least, I would like to mention 2 things. One is that the platform that the agency has set up for dialogue for civil society is open for registration, and please do take it also as an invitation to engage with the agency through the platform. And secondly, in September, 25th to 27th September, the agency is holding what we call a Fundamental Rights Forum. This is already a 2nd forum that brings together people from different walks of life, government people, civil society, but also important public figures that go beyond the politics and the civil society space, such as scientists, actors, artists, etc., to speak about fundamental rights issues. The topic of the Fundamental Rights Forum this year is on belonging, and in the context of that topic, there will be several panels addressing the situation of civil society in the European Union. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm here, of course, to answer your questions.
Zapraszam do zabrania głosu pana rzecznika.
Now if we please ask the Commissioner for Human Rights to take the floor. Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to provide the commentary on that very important report of the FRA. First of all, thank you to the FRA for actually taking up this subject and treating this topic very seriously with a deep and thorough analysis, not only of the general area of legislation systems or the freedom of assembly, but also with the more broad approach to the NGOs' activities and to the circumstances under which they operate, and CSOs, especially that those circumstances are not always fully promoting the integration of the civic society. I'd like to start by saying that in Poland, for some time now, we have seen the shrinking space for the civic society in different dimensions. What is characteristic for Poland, I think, is that our discussion is going on in waves, I would say. There are moments when we can be of impression that the level of pressure, of tension between the public services and NGOs and CSOs are greater. And yet there are also times when we can feel that the tension is lesser and we all live in harmony without greater problems. However, the effect of this cyclic nature of that relations is that with time, the space for civic society and for CSOs is shrinking. I'd like to mention a few processes that we could observe in Poland for the past 2 years, just to show you how this shrinking looks like. So let me now go back to the events before 2 years. That was an interesting moment in Poland when a lot of NGOs was engaged in defense of the General Court, of the justice system, and we could see the public, the press coverage, and we didn't really see the reaction in the public. We could see that the atmosphere around the NGOs, the very negative atmosphere around NGOs, was growing. Also, the criticism towards NGOs and organizations on the access to public information, the quality of public life, was really worsening. So very often, such activities and such approaches were not criticized by the government and were not pointed as unjust. What I want to say that in this report we see that this space for civic society shows that this is the space for such reactions that can build anxiety. Also, 2 years ago, when we were talking about the migration crisis, organizations that were working for migrants were really under regular attacks of the media and of people who simply have different view on migrants and migration. So these were really. We could see that the atmosphere around people dealing and working for migrants was really negative and really hostile, especially that public services, the government side, did not defend them at all. Also, campaigns against homophobia that we seen, and we had attacks on them as well. Although the government and public services tried to find the attackers, I cannot say that I remember any strong words of condemnation of the government or any words that would be right in such a situation, and that would show that there's a willingness to put a stop to such activities. Also, I would like to mention that we, in our constitution, there's a clear rule on non-discrimination rules. Several situations when we had those attacks where we could see those actions were taken, it translates into the unwillingness of engaging into social life or NGOs activities. What really makes a lot of hesitation here and a lot of anxiety, I have to say, is that these are discrimination of the NGOs. In 2016, the Ministry of Justice declined financing activities for the help of women who were victims of violence. And I have to say that this support was denied to the Center of Support for Women and to the National Support Center for Women. And as the Commissioner for Human Rights, I took up actions to clarify that situation. And I have to say that the ministry explained that both organizations did not get donations because their notion for help was only addressed to women, while the opponents were definitely addressed for all the victims. So that means that the well-known organization did not get any donations because allegedly they addressed their help to the too narrow group of people, namely women. The second organization I mentioned, BABA, actually was providing help for both men and women. So here the explanations of the Ministry of Justice were invalid. I have to say that even though these cases were the subject of interventions, last year we had exactly the same situations. So these situations definitely raise our doubts. And the question is whether when we have public finances for the realization of specific tasks, do the authorities follow the rules of transparency and of non-discrimination and equality, or maybe are there some other uncovered reasons not to grant this support to NGOs? I would say that these doubts are strong enough here that with the organization working for women in the Black protest, we had on the 3rd of October, we have the Black protest. That was the protest on the novelization of the Family Planning Act. And I have to say that in some headquarters of some organizations, there were controls verifying grants obtained in the past by the organizations. So you can have high doubts here whether the sequence of events here, that those controls happened exactly a day after the protest, where you can have doubts about these sequences, because maybe it shows that the authorities are not really comfortable with those organizations and their activities. So such events have a chilling effect, really. What we also can say about the activities of the authorities, this is directly about NGOs. What really matters for NGOs, this is the novelization of the Act of the Rights of Assemblies, and especially about the cyclic events. Why? Because in this case, there's a ban on any counter manifestations. And that causes a number of problems, both in legislation and in tensions between authorities and those who would like to participate in such assemblies and to execute their rights. But what it also results in is that the police decides to stop or arrest those people who would like to take part in the counter manifestation, and they the police calls it so-called preventive actions. Luckily enough, we've already managed to agree with the court that these activities are unjust and illegal. However, that really makes it difficult for those who wish to be active and to express their voice publicly. I'm happy that the report of the FRA focuses a lot on legislation and on building democratic space.
Civil society organizations do function, and they can be treated as the subjects who can impact the legislative process. Let me say that the practice in Poland is quite different, may vary, so to say. Sometimes if we have some draft laws, it turns out that in Poland you can prepare a draft of law, you can go for the public consultation, you can discuss it in parliament, and you can bring it to a legislative solution which could be to a certain extent acceptable from the perspective of the quality of the legislative process, so to say. There were some draft acts that have been done this way, followed that process. However, unfortunately, when it comes... sorry, I'm talking about it because I want to show you that if you can, if you want, you can. If there is a political will behind, we can involve the whole society on the discussion on the draft of law, and we can do it in a proper way following the democratic standards. Unfortunately, however, in case of some draft laws, there is a decision taken so that these drafts are to be submitted to Parliament as a deputies actually projects, and therefore the public consultation is omitted. When the draft law is actually a subject of work in Parliament, there is no space anymore to discuss it. It is done in such a way that there's some postulates are actually raised from the trade organizations, some NGOs. However, there is no single discussion on what is the content of this act and what its impacts can be. Going back to 2016, I remember we discussed the Anti-Terrorist Act. There was no discussion as such. I mean, there is no social discussion. Everybody agreed. The government, did not accept any arguments that would impact the content on this act. In 2017, we had the whole range of the legislation on justice system. There was one act that brought to huge demonstrations and manifestations in the street. That was the act on the Supreme Court in Poland. So when we think that the part of the democratic order in this country is a participation of civil society, treating civil society in a serious way when going through the legislative process, we at the same time may say that it did not happen on many occasions. There were many examples proving that certain acts had to be adopted as quickly as possible, and any discussion was just a formal one as the ticking box approach. The discussion was not actually meant to find out the doubts or ideas about the proposed piece of legislation. The experts from the Batory Foundation prepared their own report proving or demonstrating the faults of the system and abuse of system in individual cases. But when we talk about the rules of law and civil society as such, we have to bear in mind that there are organizations that represent certain vocational groups, professional groups, like prosecutors or the judge organizations. And these organizations specifically suffer from or challenge difficult relations with authorities. The leaders of these organizations may potentially face some litigations a risk of litigations. Specifically, when we talk about lex super omnia, such disciplinary proceedings have been already initiated against the leaders of organizations. So it's not only about the organization that deal with human rights as such, that actually work in the area of the public interest, but this is also about the organizations that represent the professional groups, and in a certain sense, they actually may run a risk of actually litigations that can be initiated against them. Ladies and gentlemen, the very specific unique challenge in the area of civil society organizations is the regulatory area. So it's not only about the authorities, the government, the way it works, whether it reacts or not properly vis-a-vis standards. This is also about the regulations that are created, that are developed. Let me mention here two regulatory aspects. The first one is the Act on the National Institute of Freedom. This act entered into force. It's a binding piece of legislation. However, we have to bear in mind that during the legislative process, it triggered lots of doubts. There were many doubts whether the act is going to guarantee transparency in the area of funding, public fundings allocated to civil societies or NGOs. There was also a doubt whether there was a need actually to create this new body if we had already the fund of the public or civil initiatives. This was one of the main source of funding provided for the civil society organizations. So these were doubts triggered by many institutions. My office also submitted official opinion on that. OECD submitted their own official opinion on that as well. This is related to the representation of the NGO sector in the board that is going to actually advise, consult this Institute of Freedom. There are 11 members, and the representatives of the civil society definitely do not constitute the majority of this board. However, the act came into force. Now we have to follow the activities of the National Institute of Freedom, how they act, what they do. Of course, they informed that we should not worry at all, but we still have to be quite prudent while following the activities. It's, however, too early actually to provide any far-reaching assessments or provide any opinions. Unfortunately, recently there was yet another draft law that may have a fundamental importance for NGOs' activities. Namely, I talk about the amendment of Act on the Public Fundraising. If we talk about the independent organizations, specifically the ones that actually operate in a way which is not always following the will of the government, or simply when we talk about the organizations who simply look for the sources of funding in various places and various sources of fundings, including crowdfunding, such act on public fundraising is of fundamental importance. Unfortunately, the draft law that was presented by the Ministry of Internal Administration changed completely the whole system. It creates or provides for the opportunity actually to limit any kind of fundraising if only minister will so. Minister may decide based on unclear and far-reaching criteria. In this context, let me say the following. Yesterday, I submitted my opinion. I submitted it at Mr. Brudziński, Minister Brudziński. This is my opinion on this very aspect. It covers dozens of pages. I'm not going to quote all arguments. And it's important, however, to say, or to quote at least the beginning of this paper, because it demonstrates the beginning of the whole story of this act. It proves that Janusz Kochanowski, the previous commissioner of human rights, the former commissioner, was giving the opinion on the Act of 1933. That was actually the case of the Great Orchestra, Great Christmas Orchestra, the charity that is raising funds. The former commissioner actually was criticizing the significance and the way of application of legislation when it comes to the provision of consent for the fundraising. So since 1990 something, there were some problems with that. There were some signals vis-a-vis this kind of charities, and NGOs undertook a great effort. And then in 2014, the amendment of the currently binding act was adopted. This is the act on the 14th of March 2014. This is an act that replaced the system of consents, and it turned it into a system of notification. So basically, if you run such a fundraising activity, you just notify the authorities about this fact. This system, unfortunately, has been destroyed. It looks like we are coming back to the previous system. The consent will have to be provided by the Minister of Public Administration, Internal Affairs, and these are really far-reaching powers that the minister may have, unfortunately. So I believe that the protests raised by many and numerous civil society organizations on the amendment of this public fundraising activities proves that it's a fundamental issue. As Madam Sobotka mentioned, the substance of the functioning of free civil society is also access to public funds. And unfortunately, this act may pose a threat to this system, to this statement. At the same time, Minister did not prove sufficiently all the threats and problems, issues that occurred so far, because right now we are discussing this issue based on one case that was published by media, presented by media, and based on that, we will limit the access to the public funds. Let me say it's a very sensitive sphere of the public life. We have to be very careful, prudent, in order not to destroy things that have been achieved in Poland already, so that we do not destroy the way that the civil society functions, the way it is using the freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, freedom of associations. In order not to destroy all these, we have to be extremely sensitive. The state must be very sensitive. We need the transparency to the maximum level and non-discriminatory approach towards the civil society organizations. Unfortunately, in this context, during last 2 years, I've noticed many worrying situations and cases. If these worrying cases actually compared against the experience of other countries, the civil society in Poland has the right actually to be worried, and it's great that it is worried and puzzled and that it is actually publicly stated. Thank you very much. Thank you for the comment, Mr. Commissioner. We would like to invite you for a discussion. We have 2 microphones, so before you take floor, please introduce yourself. Good morning. My name is Katarzyna Batko. I'm representing the Watchdog Polska Civil Networks. This is the organization that got interested in this report for some time already. What's important for me in case of this report is just focusing our attention, drawing our attention to the areas that impact the freedom of development of civil society. And in my organization, because I'm not going to repeat actually the issue of the money, the fundraising, public fundraising, the openness of the public life, the act that is not yet in place. However, when we talk about the transparency and the possibility to impact the legal system, there is the opportunity in this act that the organizations who would like to impact legislation in Poland, they have to mention the donors, including physical, natural persons, if they contribute more than 1,000 euros. So to a given organization over the 12 months. So in many areas, we believe it's terrifying. Moreover, we read in the report that we have to follow certain categories. The organizations, they represent the public purpose, right? So they should be treated differently, in a, so to say, lighter way, not that strictly. And the business doesn't follow these rules. This is only the draft. This is only the proposal, actually. It's not existing. It's not in force yet. But what I wanted to say, it's important that we undertake this discussion, that we initiated this discussion, how we act, what we do, and why is it worth to do it. We are the member of the platform of FRA, and we have actually a member always asking, you know, what is the way that our matters are represented. We say that the organizations of the public interest may be, that don't have to pay the fees in the court in case of litigations. In the past, it was the case that we didn't have to pay these fees. Now we have to. But the question is, if we are the public interest institution, in our statute we say that we undertake activity, some litigations, for instance, to promote the rights for information, and the court tells us it's none of your business. So what is wrong here? Is it the legislation is wrong or enforcement is simply wrong? Of course, we just these fees in the court. This is just an exception. But you know, recently we are suffering from the very difficult financial situation, and we asked actually the court not to impose these fees on us. And one letter that came from the court gave us an answer. And if there is, just in this answer, we read, this is the problem of the organization to provide money for your activities. At the same time, in the legislation, you have this right actually to be dismissed from this, the necessity to pay the fees. So I'm just asking myself, whether it's right or wrong. The agency, on one hand, proposes a certain format to discuss these issues. That's already important. Yes, something happened here. But my question is actually, what can we do in order to achieve agency with this type of information? I know you're a kind of research institute also, but it's not a research what we are doing. We just get some signals, and we want to transfer the signals to you. And by the way, I also believe that it's important to have a certain form of collecting information on attacks on organizations, because in case of organizations dealing with LGBT groups, the police officers undertook some actions, and in case of my organization, that was not a big issue, but actually I believe it was important still. On a fence or on the wall of the building, somebody was actually writing some abusive inscriptions, or that was kind of bullying. So what could we do? We do not have in Poland any place that would collect such data. I don't know whether police statistics would cover it or not. So without the report, probably these things would not even be discussed. But the report is forcing us actually to think about the conditions, environment actually that we are working in.
I beg you bear with me that I respond in English. I understand Polish perfectly, but my Polish is colloquial, so my answer wouldn't be up to speed, let's say. Yeah? Thank you very much. How can you keep FRA informed? Well, there are different ways. You can obviously do that through the platform. You can contact us. You can keep us alert. The fact is that when it comes to addressing situation in specific countries, I mean, FRA is limited also what we can do, and you would be perhaps better served to turn to the Ombuds institution or national institutions for help. However, as I was saying earlier, we will repeat the data collection, and that's why, and it is becoming slowly but surely a consistent area of FRA's work. It is the very first report on the situation of civil society in the EU that, in general, and that FRA has done. But it is staying. So we can only go in a direction of improving the data collection methodology. We look into that, how to even involve voices of more civil society organization. Just to, let's say, spend a few words on saying how we went about the initial assessment of the situation. The agency has in each member state's so-called FRANET focal point, which is on a basis of our guidelines collects data for us, and we are looking in ways how we could possibly do such a consultation directly, and also want to explore the fundamental rights platform as a tool for making such a data collection regular and relatively easy to complete. So this is just to respond to the question: how can you keep us informed about that? I'm very sorry about this incident that you have had with the label. Unfortunately, I have to say that this is the case in more countries than Poland, and also the name of the person that you mentioned is regularly mentioned. That's the way it is. What we can do is maybe to explore the way that really such a collection point of attacks on civil society is considered to be created.
Dziękuję serdecznie za
Thank you very much for completing my commentary here on the act of the public collection of the funds collection, and I definitely hope that the act will not be passed, especially that there are so many negative opinions yesterday from the social dialogue, for example. So this is my great hope that it won't happen, that it won't come into force. What I do as a commissioner, when there are incidents of attacks on organizations, we definitely try to clarify it, to collect the information, to provide the information on such incidents in the annual report, and to speak about such incidents publicly. When there is lack of reaction on the side of police, that is my role to try to clarify it further. I definitely encourage you to ask more questions.
Yes, my name is Christy Edwards, and I'm from the Tolerance and Non-Discrimination Department with OSCE ODIHR here in Warsaw. And I just also wanted to mention that It's better? Okay. Any incidents or attacks on organizations or individuals can, of course, be reported to the police to be investigated, hopefully properly, as a hate crime, but also can be reported to ODIHR every year for our annual hate crimes report. We do solicit information from civil society organizations as well as official data from the governments. So if you have information that you would like to share with us, it's available on our website.
Bardzo proszę o kolejne pytania.
Please ask more questions. Good morning, Tomasz Sieniow, Institute for the Fair State and the State of Law. Thank you for this report. I think that the systematics of this report is very interesting. I think it responds to certain diagnoses that we see in our organization as well. The first thing I'd like to talk is the public collection of funds and the access to it and to access to finances. Mr. Adam Bodnar mentioned that there's a limited access of the NGOs and CSOs to funding. Government has the funds from the EU, and especially the fund on migration. And for 2 years now, the government has not granted any donation to NGOs who would help integration of foreigners, of migrants, that would help changing their situation in Poland, especially a lot of immigrants from Ukraine. They need integration, and this is one thing that the government didn't use. The second thing is the grant and the funds for legal help for the migrants and refugees, and we deal with such cases. And I think it's very difficult. It's a challenge, and I think that the potential, the integration potential that we've had here in Poland was wasted, was lost. I think we've lost 60 to 80% of human resources, really. People that were prepared, trained for those purposes. And this is a challenging thing. It's also sad that the government does not follow the rules of the tenders and competitions that were basically organized by the government and announced by government, which is, especially for the integration, this is crucial. And the government said that organizations can provide help starting from the moment of the competition, because it will happen, the contest will be resolved after 60 days. And we've applied. It's been 600 days already. And the information that we were provided from the organization implementing the funds is that the contest list of the rewarded organizations is waiting for the acceptance of the minister. And this is from the November 2016. So that's a year and a half. It's very difficult to operate under such circumstances. So the access to funds is really complex. Even though we keep on asking about that, after half of a year we got an unclear answer that we have to, that new rules of funds distribution have to be set up, even though the first competitions and the first contests were not cancelled. We believe that this causes financial losses for us, financial damage, because we have to give that money on our own. And this project finishes, endowment funds, it finishes in June. We had good and bad examples here. Sometimes we have an invitation for a commentary to the draft laws, like a day before the deadline, where we are supposed to issue our opinion, and we say that this is simply not serious on the ministry side. When they need an opinion, then it would be worth giving us at least 2 weeks' time. So these are the rules of the social dialogue, but ministry does not play up to the rules. When we talk about the safe space for the organizations, I have to say that we are in a difficult situation. Tomorrow I'll be at the police station to explain certain things. For the past years, we've never been asked to come and explain our actions. This month, it's the second time we are asked to come to the prosecution proceedings to explain our activities. This is basically about the government control on the activities around migrants. These are specific organizations that would in a way break the opinion of the government. We're the watchdog organization, and even in our Facebook, we definitely undermine the results of, for example, of border guards. So we have the data from courts, for example, and we have the data on activities against foreigners, against migrants. So we are the watchdog. That's the one thing. The second thing is that organizations helping refugees are still difficult for the government. And because the commissioner mentioned that we have activities when we see that we have certain activities that can be perceived as bullying, as smear campaigns against such campaigns against such organizations are really a fact. For example, our professional lawyers, they get notifications from the authorities, and those legal advisors, they work for the refugees, and then they are summoned to their organizations, I mean professional organizations of legal advisors, for example, to explain. And our activities, when we address certain institutions, due to change in certain practices, are considered as unacceptable in certain situations. And even though some laws clearly say that we have the right to proceed in this way, that makes it impossible for us to help refugees to get to the courts, to get the legal help. So we see that the policy of defense, so-called defense of the state, is with harm and to the disadvantage of refugees and migrants. And we believe that those people who also try to help migrants and refugees are mistreated. And we are in a difficult situation here. A few words here, just a brief comment, because that would be really adding to our internal national problems. But I have to say that in Poland, we don't have a national document that would be called migration policy. It has been dismissed by the government, and no new has been constructed. And therefore, we have complex and complications on the NGOs, on the activities of such organizations, on the use of the European funds for that purpose. And that, in fact, was already talked about by the Commissioner for Human Rights. And I have to say that if the government has the policy of closing borders for people trying to get the asylum of a refugee, that happens in Tiraspol or Brest, we have in a result consequences as such. And I'm happy that together with the experts, with the commission of experts on the Commissioner for Migrants, we can together have such activities. But I very often feel that we are isolated in those activities. I see that we see Minister Kaczmarczyk here with us. Maybe you could provide some help to the NGOs working in this specific area and to provide some support for us. And thanks to that, we could, for example, solve problems with financing, for example. We could identify them and define them better. Before we move to another... oh, no.
I very much like your point about the right to good administration in relation to how the funding is administered. It is true that this report has not looked at the access to funding using the fundamental right to good administration as such. But it is an interesting point, which I'm definitely taking back. So thank you for mentioning that.
Jeszcze bardzo krótko.
And very briefly about the problem on financing within the Fund for Integration of Migrants. This problem is, in fact, a subject of consultation of European Commission and the Ministry of Internal Affairs and Public Administration. We do have a number of activities on the Polish side in order to take this fund into the voivodeship level. However, we believe that there is a problem. We know that there is a problem. We, being the representatives, we know that we are aware of the problem. We are trying to reach out to NGOs within our activities. From the last year, we, for example, started a few projects that target building awareness, building sensitivity, public sensitivity of the problem of migration and integration. And we definitely are going to continue with those activities and projects with NGOs. And maybe here I'd like to introduce NGOs that are facing problems and challenges with in the current situation, to contact us. I encourage you to contact us, to discuss it, to maybe together find some solutions or projects we could conduct together.
My name is Andrea Huber. I'm Deputy Chief of the Rule of Law Unit at OSCE ODIHR. And my question is about links between the shrinking space to civil society and changes on the laws on the judiciary. And in particular, I would like to ask the Fundamental Rights Agency whether in future reports you're intending to look at the ability of courts and tribunals to uphold the rights of freedom of assembly and freedom of speech.
Thank you very much for this very concrete question. We'll have to see about that, to be honest, because the mandate of the agency is also limited. And when it comes to freedom of assembly and speech and the ability of courts to uphold these rights, it will probably fall outside of the scope of the work of the agency.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Anna-Karin Ost. I'm working for UNHCR here in Poland. And I just wanted to jump back to the previous discussion that we had on asylum and implementation of the Asylum Migration and Integration Fund, and draw your attention to a report that was issued by UNHCR of our Brussels office earlier this year, with that's called Follow the Money. It was issued together with FRA, and it contains a number of recommendations for EU member states and also EU institutions on the implementation of the second part of the AMI funding that is going to be discussed, if I understand it, in mid-year. And many of the recommendations there are very similar to the conclusions that FRA has drawn in their report also, with regard to especially transparency, less bureaucracy, and also much more broader consultation with the civil society partners. And I can also from personal experience say that this is a recommendation that is specifically valid also in Poland.
Dziękuję za ten głos. Proszę o kolejne.
Thank you for the voice. Thank you. Filip Pozderski, the Institute of the Public Affairs, the Warsaw think tank. We are also developing a yearly annual report on the stability of the civil society. It's a part of actually a bigger report prepared by the American Agency for the Eastern European market and Asian market. And based on this report, I would like to supplement your observations. First of all, I would like to thank you for your report, very important remarks and findings on the situation in Poland and Europe. However, I would like to ask you yet another question, just to supplement. Let me say that the atmosphere around the national policy translates quite obviously into a local situation, local environment when it comes to the approach towards the NGOs dealing with the certain specific groups, the funding available for NGOs dealing with LGBT groups. So if we have partnership with other organization that doesn't specifically deal with LGBT aspects, the funding can be provided. But if you just ask if the LGBT organization asks for a fund, the fund is not granted. That's one comment. Another comment is actually also another comment important for the civil society organizations is actually fact that the private sector is actually withdraw their support in the NGOs, specifically if these NGOs are the subject of negative opinions, public opinions. The business therefore doesn't want to actually engage in the activities undertaken by such organizations. So my question is about the following fact. Do you see similar situation in other countries? What is your opinion when it comes to the significance of this phenomenon? Because what we see in Poland is also this very strong division. There is a huge gap also in the civil society, and I would like to refer to the very topic of this meeting. It translates to the aspects of human rights as well. So briefly speaking, organizations that protect human rights, protect minorities, sexual minorities, ethnic minorities, any other minorities, they actually face these allegations that these are not the fundamental rights that are breached, that are that are actually infringed. In Poland, let's say, religious majority should be respected, and the families of the majority should be respected, their rights should be respected, and it translates in a situation where the organizations dealing or focusing on the minorities that these organizations should not be supported, they should not get funds because it's less important aspect of the social life and the functioning of our society. So again, my question, what do you see? Well, do you see a similar actually situation, similar approach to such organizations in other countries? What do you think about it? How would you assess this situation?
Beyond the thematic focus, I mean, it is of course related to this report, but what may be of interest is that the agency has conducted a survey on the situation of LGBTI persons, and this survey will be again repeated. And there are a number of thematic reports that cover this area, which is comparative, and it goes across different countries. So maybe that is more specific to the question concerning the situation of LGBTIQ persons.
Ja chciałem powiedzieć, że mój mandat.
Let me just say that my mandate does not cover monitoring of the situation in different countries. However, for many years I've been working for the Helsinki Foundation, and I followed development of the civil society in other countries, in other states. And of course, the threats for the sector can be observed not only in Poland, in many other countries of the region, Eastern European countries. These threats have been visible for years already. Specifically, recently, it's a growing problem in Hungary. However, my experience actually also covered the situation in Russia, in Azerbaijan, and I can say that we definitely can see a global trend here. Certain negative solutions adopted in one state can be then adopted by other countries, and they translate into other environments. So it's not that we are the isolated islands and we develop our own solutions, but the systemic solutions that prove to be effective elsewhere, that limit, unfortunately, the civil society activities, are adopted, unfortunately, by other countries following similar political trends. Monika Łagodzińska, the Foundation of the Lifelong Learning. We are from Poznań. We also have the Europa Cafe network. Two brief questions. Is the report going to be continued and published next year? And I would like to ask you for the translation, because if you want actually to promote this report on the local regional level, it would be great to have this report in Polish, available in Polish, and at least, you know, the significant part of it, because the English language for some of the organization is a foreign language. It's a challenge for local authorities, and locally nobody is going to translate it. Another question about the fundraising, public fundraising. This fundraising and something what we call crowdfunding, don't we have the attempt actually to equal these two type of fundraisings? Do you believe, Mr. Commissioner, that there is actually a way to limit fundraising through the making these two type of raising actually equal?
The civil society organizations working on human rights already this year, because we want to inform the upcoming European Commission colloquium in November. So the initial results will be most likely available already this year. That's the first question. The second question is Polish language. Yes, absolutely, I agree. It needs to be translated. In fact, we do not translate the whole report, but we do translate summaries in languages of all the member states that we will actually go and present it more locally. And we are always open to opportunities to go further locally. FRA staff is multilingual, so if need be, we can also find a person speaking the particular national language. The versions in Polish, I think they should be available within a month or so.
Ja odpowiem w taki sposób, że...
Let me say the following. I do hope that this act on the public fundraising will not be adopted, hopefully, and we will not need to discuss next steps or the upcoming ideas for limitation of activities of CSOs. If I may have a question, this Endowment for Democracy is a very important instrument, especially in some cases it works very quickly, it's very flexible, it can be used immediately, and therefore certain organizations do not have to actually face some problems, so to say. Now such an endowment is going to be created for the EU organization, or for the EU, for the NGOs in the EU area, right? What kind of criteria is going to be taken? Any details that have been discussed so far?
There are a lot of discussions about how such a fund should look like. To be honest, the agency is not the best person, the best institution to answer this question. However, there have been different hearings in the Parliament. The European Economic and Social Committee is actively engaged in looking into issues of the utility. There have been a number of meetings organized with civil society organizations and foundations. And it would be up to the European Commission, I would assume, to make a proposal for such a fund and criteria of it.
Jedno tylko zdanie.
Just one more sentence, please. I'm not really able to fully agree that always such instruments are safe, because I have observed myself, I followed actually the case of my colleague from Azerbaijan, Rafa Janov, who actually received support from the European Endowment Fund, and he became a prisoner, a political prisoner. It did not protect him at all. So each type of funding, when it comes, when there is actually the negative approach from the prosecutor's side, doesn't can't. So if the authorities believe that the source of findings is the wrong source of funding, then it is not a protection for a given person. So, but it's still safer than, you know, coming with an envelope full of money, right? Well, there is no trace of the banking transaction. Next question, please. Małgorzata Szuleta, the Helsinki Foundation for Human Rights. I would like to thank the Agency for Fundamental Rights for taking this problem and developing the report. One word of comment. I understand that the development of this report must have actually finished at a certain stage. Therefore, the report do not refer to the recent events in Poland. However, the general comment that, of course, was mentioned by the Commissioner as well. In Poland, Hungary, and other countries, there is a clear crisis of rules of law and fundamentals of the democratic states. There is a shrinking space for the civil society area as well. There are many, many examples supporting this thesis. We were talking about the rights, the freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, or fundraising. But let me just actually draw your attention to the recent proposal or the act that was adopted, on the Institute of Memory, National Institute of Memory. This is actually also undermining the reputation of Poland. This is a worry of NGOs, those who actually advocate for Poland, that this law will be actually utilized in order to create this kind of chilling effect for the NGOs, organizations that actually trigger doubts about the amendment of law, reform of the justice system, and similar topics. Now, the question addressed at the agency, FRA. It's about the report. I would like to ask you whether, going beyond 2018, are we going to organize the similar study using this formula of the annual report covering 10 topical areas? Maybe you have an idea actually to take the civil society topic and combine it with all these 10 areas. As I said, in the times of crisis, of rule of law, this may be also very important.
Ewa Kulik-Bielińska, Fundacja.
Ewa Kulik-Bielińska, Stefan Batory Foundation. I won't be very original by saying thank you for the report and for, I think, a very proper approach to the shrinking of civil society space in those 4 dimensions. You said that the data was from the time period of 2009 up until now. The paradox is that I think that if I spoke 3 years ago, I would say that we have, in each of every dimension, we have some things, some room for improvement. However, now I have to say that for the past 2 years, we've seen really fast degradation of the situation of the civil society in Poland. I believe that this happens on the level of certain administrative decisions, not only about NGOs, because NGOs work in so many areas. For example, the last example, the report issued by the organization called Institute for Ordo Iuris Law. And there's a denunciation of several number of organizations that deal with young people, that provide educational activities, non-discrimination activities, non-discrimination education. And there's a call for, on one hand, by the authorities, by the representatives of the Ministry of Education, and also by the parents, to block the presence of these people, to block their access to schools so that they cannot educate anymore. So this is shocking that right now authorities believe that such actions are not in line with the ruling party values, because they address and revoke the conservative approach. So that's why we deal with refugees and migrants, those that are perceived as carriers that can threat pose a threat to our security, and that's why the state wants to limit their numbers in Poland. Women are perceived as a threat, and women's rights right now are so that a husband should decide whether they can beat their women and be violent towards them or not. And this traditional pattern of a family where the husband decides on his wife's rights, whether she works or not. This is what the ruling party wants. Then organizations that protect children's rights, for example, this is again coming back. Those organizations were just as those organizations working for the protection of women's rights, like BABA. Also, they were denied the donations. The organizations that we give children the strength. This is the organization that helps children. Also, organizations dealing with children who were victims of domestic violence and that were sexually harassed. Again, such organizations do not get donations and also are on the list of the hostile, in a way, agencies, because this is again denying that children may in fact be victims of their family members. So if we see what's going on in the civil society space, we see that there are some organizations that work for the rights of those people. And in the eyes of the ruling party of the government, such organizations are banned from the public rights. There is an act that is under works right now. This is a draft law that obliges the organizations to disclose the data of their donors. So this will be a paralyzing effect to such NGOs. Also, other examples of, for example, serving public purpose. So that is not in line with the clear interest of the government. So, for example, the Białowieska forest, again, then we have two conflicting public interests here. And again, now we have the new aspect of the public collection of funds. Again, when there's, again, a conflict of interests, then again, for example, ecologists won't be able to raise funds and won't be able even to articulate their expressions and formulate their opinions and express them. So this is so interesting. Now it's 14th of March, and it's 4 years from since the act was passed on the freedom of speech and of expression, and on NGOs as well. Because if the public resources are cut, just as it is happening right now by the government for the organizations that, in the eyes of the government, does not do right, then again, those activities will be limited. And again, the goals of organizations that are not in line of the goals of the political agenda will be hindered and will be actually limited completely from the possibility to operate and to be active. So what is happening on right now? We have a campaign right now. We are collecting signatures under the petition to the government on the act on the public collection of funds to stay in an untouched, unchanged form. Thank you very much. We have to be finishing slowly. The commissioner has to leave as well. That's why I would ask a final word. Oh, no, we have the word by Mr. Minister. I was in a way asked by the commissioner to take the floor, so that's why I would like to say a few words. First of all, thank you very much for the report. I think this is the report that is definitely worth discussing, and the information that it encloses, I think it's worth to use it for the discussion of the condition of the civil society. I do not share some of the more alarming words here about the shrinking space of the civil society in Poland. The opinions that we've heard here are the opinions showing individual, really, examples and incidents of wrongdoing. And of course, we always have to react in such situations. I am always, and I've always been shocked by the information by Katarzyna Batko about the names that turn out, that show negative emotions towards NGOs. And if police does not react, you should definitely alarm us about it, and other public services will intervene. If we talk about the Asylum Fund, I will definitely pass this information to the head of the committee, and he will definitely look into it. However, the Act on Public Collection of Funds, if you allow me, I'd like to say that a day before yesterday, Prime Minister Gliński addressed a number of remarks to the amendments to the draft law. And I believe that this is a very good time for discussion right now. Also for the NGOs, and I believe that the opinions, the criticizing opinions of NGOs, who are talking about the possibility of limiting the fundraising, whether individual or corporate philanthropy in Poland, I believe that they are justified, and I believe that those CSOs have the very real impact they can have on the society as well, to make sure that such incidents won't happen. However, I'd like the discussion that we're having here to happen based on more credible evidence. If the commissioner, if Mr. Commissioner is talking about the campaign of public TV, NGOs, and the lack of the reaction of authorities, then it is untrue, Mr. Commissioner, because other than the text that we together constructed with Prime Minister Gliński, also the Prime Minister has openly criticized the campaign, and this is when the campaign ceased to exist. Excuse me, because it touched the wife of the Prime Minister, and this is why it happened. Let's say it openly. Well, actually, the Prime Minister was talking about someone else in his TV speech, and the first reaction on the Prime Minister was when the campaign happened, just started, and did not touch the wife of the PM. When you talk about the attacks on the LGBTE attacks and the headquarters of the organizations and the lack of the reaction of the authorities, let me remind you about my own reaction when I was also very critical, very clear against such incidents. In May 2016, we've organized in the Prime Minister's office consultation with NGOs on the aspects of the activities of the country and operations of the country in this regard. What it turns out, it's other than the singular incidents, the country and the state learns how to react to such incidents. That's why I'm so surprised by the Katarzyna Batko's opinion. Of course, these are only incidents when the police does not react, and that should be definitely addressed. I wouldn't like to hear opinions in a public discussion when we hear representatives of one organizations calling other organizations as so-called NGOs. that does not build a nice and a good dialogue atmosphere. I think overuse in a narration is that there are certain privileged organizations. Those were, like, for example, when we have the opinion that that in the Polish families and in the view of the government, the husband is the one who decides whether to use violence against his wife or not. I think that we should not use arguments like that in a public discussion. And thank you very much for your engagement, your participation, also for the critical opinions. I think the civil society situation in Poland, just as in many other member states, could be improved. But let's just base our discussions and dialogues and our narration based on the evidence. And of course, we definitely build our relation with you in a very full of care way. Thank you very much, Mr. Minister. Thank you, Mrs. Ewa Sobotka, and the Commissioner Adam Bodnar from the participation in today's meeting, for the presentation of the report, for the commentary, and for your opinions. Let me just conclude by saying thank you to all the representatives of the European Union that have all the values at heart. And if you are concerned about the values of the European Union, and if you have any concerns, please contact us.
To mi chyba nic innego nie pozostaje.
Actually, the only thing I want to say is just to invite you for lunch. Thank you very much.